Welcome back to Antisocial Studies. All right, we all know where this is heading, so let's just cut to the chase. Because of the Mexican-American War, the U.S. has all this new land. And remember, every time we acquire new land, the slavery debate rears its head. Should this new territory allow slavery or be free? But something we haven't talked about yet is that throughout the 19th century, as we expanded and got new territory, the abolition movement, or the movement to completely end slavery, was also growing. Of course, there'd been abolitionists before now, but by the decade of Jackson's presidency, the 1830s, the abolition movement was firmly established. This is thanks in part to an evangelical religious movement that brought social issues into the forefront of our national conversation, the Second Great Awakening. Remember that the First Great Awakening occurred about 100 years earlier in the 1730s, as religious leaders worried that the Age of Reason and the development of trade and wealth in colonial New England were distracting Protestants from their religious principles. The Second Great Awakening occurred similarly as evangelical leaders saw the Founding Fathers in the early United States establish itself firmly as a secular nation. This clear separation of church and state both concerned many Protestant leaders, but it also provided the freedom from government control to begin widespread popular movements that brought religion to the people in large camp-style meetings. One of the main messages of the Second Great Awakening was the need for Christian values to permeate American society. This meant that many Christians began looking at social issues like drinking, poverty, and slavery through the lens of Christianity. And apparently they realized that Jesus probably wouldn't have been super happy about enslaving millions of people for your own wealth. So Christians, especially women, got more involved in social movements like abolition. Another popular movement at the time was the temperance movement, or the push to ban alcohol. In general, let's just take note of the fact that women are slowly expanding their sphere of influence so that they can become more involved in public life. Throughout the 19th century, they're going to focus mostly on issues that were still seen as traditionally female, helping those less fortunate, children, education, keeping the family together. But what they're really doing is getting experience organizing political movements. In fact, the same year the Mexican-American War ended, 1848, the modern women's rights movement began in Seneca Falls, New York, with the Declaration of the Rights of Women. Get it, ladies? For now, many activists, men and women, became increasingly convinced that slavery needed to end outright. Newspapers like William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator and organizations like the Anti-Slavery Society, both founded in 1831 and 1833 respectively, helped spread the message in the North. Interestingly, the society broke apart because they disagreed on whether they should also be fighting for women's equality. William Lloyd Garrison's faction thought that women's rights and women's leadership in the abolition movement were important issues that they should be fighting for as well. Cool, thanks, William. The other development that helped spread the abolition movement was the increasing availability of testimonials from freed, formerly enslaved people. The most famous was Frederick Douglass, and I'm going to do a whole deep dive on him next. The abolition movement became more and more popular in the North, and it simultaneously angered the South. How dare those Northerners tell us how to live our lives and not enslave people? It got so bad that the House of Representatives had to institute a gag rule that banned any discussion of abolition for almost a decade. But by the end of the 1840s, it was impossible not to talk about slavery when the U.S. increased its size thanks to the Mexican-American War. And while the abolition movement was growing, it was more common in political life to see some Northerners, especially politicians, becoming something called FreeSoilers. So instead of outright ending slavery, this meant that they didn't believe slavery should be extended into any new land or soil. For example, just a few months into the Mexican-American War, Congressman David Wilmot of Pennsylvania introduced a proposal to ban slavery in any territory acquired from the war. The provision, attached to a bill to provide money for the war effort, passed the House along sectional lines. Basically, free state representatives voted for it, and slave state representatives voted against it. But in the Senate, the slave states had more power because the numbers were balanced, right? Thanks, great compromise. Southern senators rejected the provision, instead proposing that we just extend the line that had been established decades earlier in the Missouri Compromise. Basically, any new state below the southern border of Missouri would be a slave state, and any state north of that line would be free. Neither side could come to an agreement, and both proposals died in Congress. Complicating things even more, by 1849, California had enough white English-speaking residents to apply for statehood, and this created a problem for Congress, because there wasn't another territory that was ready to be admitted. California didn't have a buddy. Beyond that, Congress wasn't even sure whether California would be admitted as a free or slave state, because according to the newly drafted state constitution, only white men were acknowledged as citizens, which was not uncommon at this time. But in addition, As the Native American communities came under attack from the newly arrived white colonizers, many of their orphaned children were being literally sold into slavery by Californians. So that's awful. Despite these problems, Congress decided to admit California as a free state as part of a compromise passed in 1850. This was called, wait for it, the Compromise of 1850. Congressmen from slave states did not like that California was upsetting the balance in Congress. Now there would be more senators from free states. So in exchange, they got the way more rigid Fugitive Slave Law that made it so that free states had to help return escaped slaves to slave states, or else they would be violating federal law. Ironically, the Fugitive Slave Law was a short-term win for pro-slavery groups, but long-term, it probably pushed more moderates over to the side of abolition. Most white people in free states didn't have to have much of an opinion on slavery. They could sit back and say it was bad, but it's none of my business. What could they do about it? That sort of thing. But now, they were being told that they had to turn in potential runaway slaves or risk themselves getting into trouble. Not to mention that most Northern women had just finished reading their newest book club pick, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a fictional novel that did what historical fiction does best. It humanizes otherwise distant figures and builds empathy for people you do not know. All of a sudden, the horrors of slavery became more real, with fugitives being grabbed on your doorstep and fictional enslaved people capturing your heart as you read about their lives. Of course, there were many abolitionists who had seen the horrors of slavery long ago and were willing to take more direct action. The Underground Railroad had already existed, but with the stronger Fugitive Slave Law, the operation escalated quickly. For context, Harriet Tubman escaped from slavery herself in 1849, 1 year before this compromise was passed. Now, I could go on for a long time about the Underground Railroad, but for now, I just want to mention one aspect of it that's often misunderstood. At least I didn't understand it. The Underground Railroad was not nearly as secretive as we imagine. Obviously, in the South it was, and those like Harriet Tubman who are going into the South to free eventually 300 slaves had to operate covertly. But in many parts of the North, the Underground Railroad was this open secret. Towns held Underground Railroad bake sales, and individuals announced themselves in the press as that city's conductor of the Underground Railroad. Many parts of the North flaunted the Fugitive Slave Act to the point that people like William Seward sheltered runaways in his basement while he was serving as a U.S. Senator. Ironically, northern states invoked states' rights to argue that local and state officials did not have to comply with the federal Fugitive Slave Law. Again, the question, who's more powerful, state or the federal government? And this is not to diminish the danger and sacrifice of those who operated this Underground Railroad network of trails and safe houses that helped thousands of people escape slavery. But for our purposes, it's important that we understand how angry Southern slave owners were that many in the North were so blatantly disregarding this new law. That can't be good for sectional tensions. Now, one place in the North that was interestingly not as much of a hotbed of abolition as we might expect was New York City. The city invested in and sold Southern-grown crops, not to mention financing the purchase of enslaved people. Wall Street was literally built as the financier of the slave trade. Some of the first stocks were to protect slave traders' investments in enslaved people. New York's economy was so tied to the South that one newspaper editor proclaimed that the city was, quote, almost as dependent upon Southern slavery as Charleston. All of this is just to remind us that it's not quite as simple as North versus South. So the Fugitive Slave Law was terrible, but in general, FreeSoilers kind of won the Compromise of 1850. In addition to getting California, they also established that the rest of the Mexican territory would decide whether to be free or slave based on a popular vote. This concept is known as popular sovereignty. And yeah, even though this is another example of Congress refusing to deal directly with the question of slavery, now instead of a balance, they're just letting the people figure it out for themselves, it is a sign that the national mood is trending toward making new territories free, or at least not requiring that new territories have an equal amount of slave states. Finally, as part of this compromise, the slave trade was outlawed in D.C. Wait, what? I thought we banned the slave trade in 1808. Well, we did. But we only banned the international slave trade. For the last 40 years, there continued to be a thriving domestic slave trade, nicknamed the Second Middle Passage, in which enslaved people were bought and sold between Americans, with DC acting as a major hub. So that was also banned in 1850, another sign that the nation was slowly moving toward agreeing that slavery was, bad. Back to popular sovereignty for a second. This concept was extended to more territories under the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the decision to allow new states to vote to be free or slave upset the highly controlled balance and put this hugely important decision into the hands of regular voters. It's kind of like Brexit, but that's a topic for another day. And passionate Americans on both sides of the issue saw this as an opportunity to have a direct influence on the future of the country. For example, starting in 1854, residents of the new state of Kansas held elections to decide whether to enter the Union as a free or slave state. On the eve of the elections, slavery advocates and abolitionists flooded into the territory so that they could vote in the election and decide that state's future. In the first vote, just to decide who their non-voting representative would be, Congress later found 1,729 instances of voter fraud and 1,114 illegal votes. In one voting location, only 20 out of the 604 voters were actually residents of the Kansas Territory. It was chaos. By 1855, there were two completely separate governments that both claimed control over the territory. One was backed by pro-slavery advocates, mostly from Missouri. This one was officially recognized by the U.S. government, while another rival government was run by abolitionists. By the following year, violence had erupted between various groups across Kansas. Pro-slavery groups, nicknamed border ruffians, were violently looting anti-slavery towns. Meanwhile, a militant abolitionist named John Brown orchestrated the murder of 5 pro-slavery settlers. For months, small militias roamed Kansas and clashed at various towns across the territory. The bloodshed only calmed with the arrival of federal troops almost 5 years after the first state election. But this calm still saw periodic outbreaks of violence in the 3 years leading up to the Civil War. Basically, the Civil War started in Kansas 8 years earlier than it did in the rest of the country. So the powder keg was full. Righteous anger spread across the country, and people were clearly divided. All we need now is a match, and this whole thing's gonna blow. Remember that annoying guy who refused to give up his crusade to find the spot where the Mexican-American War began? Yeah, that tall, skinny guy, he's gonna be our match. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.